Hi, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Um, this is Documenting an Agile Team, How to Keep Up. Just a little bit more about me for some background. Amazing.io is a hosting company. So we have a product, Lagoon, which is our open source deployment tool. So while our primary focus is supporting our customers, we're also developing the product that helps us to support them. So we have a small team, just about 30 people, including some folks that we share across our sister companies. And we have about a dozen engineers and me. I am the documentation writer. So I am responsible for all of the documentation with a main focus on our public facing docs. So, how to keep up with the pace of an agile team? This is really tough, and it depends very heavily on how your team works. But I've come up with some things that I think can translate to just about any situation. One of the first things is to just invite yourself. Sometimes the documentation writer can get excluded from the more technical team meetings. So invite yourself to them. You might find out that you don't need to be there all of the time, but make that decision for yourself. The next thing is to be accessible. One of the ways that I've tried to make myself accessible as the team's documentation writer and to give our team dedicated places to discuss and look at our docs is by making spaces for them inside of the resources that we already use. So we have a dedicated Slack channel just for documentation related discussions, which has been super helpful. I also have a Jira board that shows every ticket that's tagged with documentation or is in our documentation epic. That way, even if a ticket wasn't created by or assigned to me, I can still keep track of it if it's related to documentation. You also need to be flexible. I am always juggling multiple projects and things at once. And what I plan to do for the week on Monday is often not what I wind up getting done on Friday. And that's fine, as long as I'm doing what the team needs to get done and what helps our customers and our company. I have a plan for what I want to get done, but there's also a lot of things moving and shifting at once, and it's important not to be too rigid in your planning that you can't adapt. And I'm sorry if you hear any squeaks in the background. I have pet guinea pigs that live in my office, and sometimes they act up a little bit when I'm speaking. The next thing is to have a process. So how your team works from user stories to tickets to delivery can make this easy on you. If your project manager writes good user stories, those stories can inform what you need to write and document, along with what the engineers need to build. It also helps to be collaborative. There are a lot of different ways that I work with the different folks on my team to get the information that I need to flesh out documentation. Sometimes they might talk through it themselves while making a demo and send me a video to work from. Sometimes we'll have a call together and record it, and then I can reference that. I often have folks just write up a Google Doc that we'll finalize together and that I can then move into our documentation. And some other people might only have time to give me the basics and some bullet points, and I go from there. The main thing is to work with each team member in a way that suits them. Things tend to move very quickly, and no one on my team is ever not busy. So I want to get what I need from people in a way that lets me do my work, but also works for their daily workflow. Another major thing is being aware of changes before they happen. This is part of trying to keep up and being aware of what's going on with your code base. Ideally, some of the tips we've just gone over will help keep you in the loop, but it's not always going to. So we can do more. The next tip is to monitor everything. Firstly, I keep an eye on pull requests, and I instruct that any pull request that change documentation or adds to documentation gets assigned to me. Or if I had a docs team, I would want it to be assigned to someone on the docs team. But that relies on humans to tell you what they're doing, and that is not always reliable. So one of the best things that I've done to stay on top of things is attending regular calls with the product team to be aware of current and incoming changes. So I know what's going on and I know what's incoming. Regular calls with the product owner, who also happens to be my manager. So this is easy for me because we're already having one-on-ones. Skimming relevant Slack channels. Like I said, invite yourself. These might be channels that you don't actively participate in, but lurk in. Also, give yourself permission to participate in them too. If engineers are discussing a major change that you've never heard about, feel free to say, hey, when is that scheduled to roll out? Do we have a ticket for that? Are there docs for that? Is there a ticket for that documentation? Find out. There is a sort of historical idea of tension between doc teams and engineering teams. And I think a huge part of tearing down that divide is remembering that we are all peers on the same team working towards the same goal. I don't know if my team gets annoyed when I'm always asking about documentation, but for the most part, they're excited and happy that there is someone to work on the documentation. And I think most engineers will feel the same way. The main idea is just to find out where changes are being talked about and be there. Like I said, sometimes I feel like a broken record, but I'm always popping up in meetings to say, hey, is that documented? Do we have a documentation plan for that? Do you need me to write up docs for that? But if it exists, it should be documented, and so I ask. But sometimes you're going to miss things. Something will be merged when you're asleep or sick or on vacation, or you'll just be merrily working away and suddenly notice that things aren't right. So what do? Being diplomatic when breaking changes are introduced. This is actually what inspired me to give this talk. A couple of things happened recently that caused some links and media in our documentation to break. And while my initial instinct was to be annoyed, I kept my cool while we figured out what happened. The first incident was that we changed our default branch in GitHub from master to main. I knew that this was happening, but I didn't know when the button was going to be pressed. Unfortunately, when this did happen, a lot of links broke, and I had no idea it happened. And it got pointed out to me by someone else, and I was so embarrassed. So after fixing it, I resolved to implement measures to keep that from happening again. At about the same time, a handful of YouTube videos that I'd created for supplementing our documentation also broke. Our marketing team handles those, and it turned out that they had updated the intros and outros to the video, but instead of replacing the same video at the same URL in YouTube, they had uploaded totally new ones. I really wasn't happy about that, especially as those videos had already been used and shared in various places, but I knew that our marketing team was just trying to make us look good. So we talked, and I explained why the URLs needed to stay the same, and also requested that any other changes to documentation-related content get run by me first. It can be really hard not to be irritated when things break and it makes you look bad. Documentation is my domain at our company. I own it. I'm responsible for it. And when things are out of my control, I don't like it. But I know that at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal. So, if you're anything like me, take a minute. If you know that you can be a little bit hot-headed or get a little snippy, don't talk about it right away, especially if you're working remotely. Walk around the block, have a snack, then come back and calmly discuss it. If you're remote, it might help to hop on a video chat. Text can be hard, especially if someone is tense. It can be easier to talk it out in person and make sure that you don't accidentally say something that's taken in a way that you didn't mean. So wait until you're not annoyed anymore and discuss it in person or on a video call. We've already mentioned a couple of these, but next, let's talk about some technical solutions to help keep track of changes and problems in your documentation. So like I said, lurk in the engineering channels. even if you're not super active in them. Use your issue tracking software to keep an eye on all things documentation related. Like I said, I have a Jira board. We have a documentation epic. If it says documentation on it, I have a board where I can see absolutely everything. Have a dedicated channel in Slack or whatever your chat client is to discuss documentation. This has made somehow such a huge difference in the ability of our team to find somewhere to discuss things. Before it was like, oh, do we discuss the documentation in the channel of the thing that we're documenting? But then maybe not everyone's in that channel. So now we just have this documentation channel and everything goes in there and it is wonderful. You can also set up notifications in GitHub or whatever version control you're using so that you get notifications of new PRs. Another thing that has been really helpful is to use linters to check for things like broken links. There are differing schools of thought when it comes to having external links in your documentation because you can't control that external URL. I personally prefer to be able to refer to other information and other documentation, so we use a linter to check for broken links. This also helps us keep track of internal links. Even on a small team, we may be moving or renaming repositories or branches that we point to, and this enables us to make sure we're never pointing to broken links. The main idea here is to find, again, the technical spaces where decisions are being made and where you can see what's going on, and find a way to watch those spaces. Find the way that works best for you. Your workflow and your day is going to look different from your engineers and your project managers and your product owners. But where you overlap is where you can find out what's going on and stay on top of things. Next up is how to prioritize when you have to catch up to changes. Sometimes you're going to fall behind or find out that there has been a code or functionality change without a documentation change, but don't panic. Ask yourself a couple of questions and then proceed. Is anything broken? What has been changed that customers need to know about right now? Do they have to change any settings or configurations to continue using the product as they had been? If not, it's not an emergency. Don't lose sleep over it. As soon as you can. When it comes to documentation, the minimum viable product is what you're aiming to publish quickly. Get the steps the user needs to use your product. For example, if they're going to need to go through an install process, get those install steps up. If there's a complex configuration required to use the product, make sure that that information is live as quickly as possible. The other details can wait. Another helpful thing I have found just when it comes to prioritizing work in general is ensuring that we're able to track the search terms that are used by people inside of our documentation. So the solution that we use to host our documentation has a pretty robust search. And so I can review what those terms are each week or each month and know what our users are looking for in our documentation. So this allows me to focus on adding or improving or highlighting items in those categories. Sometimes the search, doesn't really tell me much because people might be searching for things and I know that they're finding them because I know that that documentation is in there, and I can also see in our Google Analytics that people are getting to the things that they need. But I find that the internal search is really helpful when I find repeated keywords that people are searching for that they're not finding. My next tip is to organize your odds and ends. Don't make more work for yourself. I write a lot every single day. Internal docs, customer-facing docs, sets of docs delivered correctly. I have notes, I have bits of docs, I have half-written docs, you name it. But it's all completely, perfectly organized on Google Drive, on my computer. Even my notebook, everything gets a heading and a date. I title everything. There's no untitled documents floating around in my Google Drive. If it exists, I can find it and I can search for it. I never have to write something twice that I know that I've written because I can't find it. So keep everything that you've written organized and searchable. You never know when you're going to need it someday. And finally, make sure that you write excellent release notes. Here we can make our process work for us. In an ideal world, you have been writing user stories and tickets and good pull requests, so there's very little left to write here. This is something that you can make easier with templates. Template everything. This also makes things easier for your engineers, as they tend to be the people, at least where I work, the engineers do the releases. So we make sure that they're able to collect all of the information from our pull requests. It gives us the information needed for the release notes. Collect this information and make sure that it's both make sure that it is both useful and readable. If the information in your release notes isn't human readable or useful to your users, why do you bother with it? There's no need to write a clever paragraph like some people do in the App Store, but do give your users actual information. What issues have you closed? What security threats have been addressed? What bugs have been fixed? What new documentation has been written? These will give you good, useful release notes that people will actually read. One resource that I used while writing this talk that I highly, highly recommend is this fantastic book called The Product is Docs. It's by Christopher Gales and the Splunk documentation team. I highly recommend it to anyone who is writing documentation in pretty much any context. I got a lot out of this book and will absolutely be referring to it as I continue my documentation work. And that was a lot of information for a very short talk. So I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. You can also find me on Twitter at aburke626, and I am always happy to answer your questions there.
Well, thank you so much. And as you said, that was a lot of information packed into, frankly, a really dense talk. So we'll give the audience a moment to generate their questions. You can use the Q&A feature. So if you'll indulge me, I have a question of my own that I'd like to ask, which is, as an engineer, if I want to be interacting with the people who are writing the documentation more effectively, what can I be doing either at a code level or really at any level to help the documentation team to do their jobs better?
Well, I think the first thing you would want to do is speak to your specific documentation team and find out what works for them. But in general, I always tell my engineers that I'm always willing to sit down and talk with them at any time. If someone wants to, put a meeting in my calendar and we can just talk through what needs to be documented. I think that it's really helpful if the engineers can start thinking about documentation as they're doing their work, which of course is one of the issues. Documentation tends to be the last thing that people think of, or it's an afterthought. But if you think of it as you're doing your work, or you start writing down bullet points, like as things are being, developed, and hopefully these documentation points will also reflect the user story and the tickets and the things that have, become a part of the process leading to whatever you're developing. If you can just sort of, kind of keep all of those at the top of mind, or start writing some bullet points while you're developing, I think the documentation at the end becomes less of a scary thing I have to do when I'm done all of this. And, oh, hey, this is a thing I already have half done. Now I can go through and flesh it out. Is that helpful?
Right, that's fair. Absolutely. And you touched on something there, which is that documentation is sort of seen as an afterthought. And this is a theme that comes up with testing as well, right? That oftentimes,
Yes.
like, we wrote the code, it works, it's in production. Oh, wait, I guess we should also write some tests. In the same way that there is a test-driven development movement or methodology? Is there a documentation-driven development methodology?
I think there is. I'm not sure if it's called that, but there are definitely people who sort of feel that writing the documentation sort of along with the tests, and I think it also tends to be the people who are very test driven development, with this sort of like, let's do everything as as we develop. But unfortunately, I think that comes down to resources, and do we have the time to develop and also write the documentation and also write the tests, which when we have small teams, something tends to fall by the wayside, and unfortunately it tends to be testing and documentation.
Right. So along those lines, then, what would you suggest would be ways to promote the importance of documentation or testing, I suppose, within an organization? What are some ways that you can, encourage this to be top of mind for engineers or product people or anybody within a technical organization?
I think one of the things that you could do to try and get buy-in, especially if you need it from higher up, is, speaking to your users and your customers and getting their frustrations, and also speaking to your support people. Like, I know that our support people spend most of their day just sending documentation links to people because it's already out there and it exists. But we somehow, it's clear that there's something we're not doing, that something isn't good enough. They're not finding this information, and we're trying to figure out why. So I think if you can speak to the people who need the documentation and get some information from them about, what are your frustrations? What are your issues? How could documentation help you? And sort of present the business case of, the better our documentation is, the happier our customers are, and the better it makes us look. And I think documentation can also be a really great marketing tool. If you have this really great documentation and it explains your product really well and it looks really great, if people come across that, they're going to think really well of you. They're going to say, oh, wow, this is a company that's on top of their stuff. They know their stuff. Look how technical and well written and everything this is. So there are so many benefits to having good documentation and absolutely zero downsides to it. So I think a lot of it is just finding, who do you have to prove it to? What kind of business case do you need to make? And then talking to the people who can give you some of that evidence.
That makes sense. Tying it to business goals and tying it to product goals sounds like an excellent avenue. So thank you for that. So we do have some questions coming in. We got one that's been well upvoted here, which is could you ask about note-taking apps one that you use, or can you recommend apps for structural storage and retrieving of notes and information?
I honestly use Google Docs. I have tried to use more complex things, but when you're working on a large team and you want to be collaborative, Google Docs works really well for me.
What about Google Docs works within this context as opposed to something perhaps a bit more esoteric?
One, most people know how to use it, so that's helpful, and it's not, learning a new tool. But I think it's just really great for collaborative writing. Someone can start a draft, someone else can pick it up. You can go back and forth. The ability to add suggestions is really nice, the way that they have that, the comments. So I found that if you need to write something collaboratively, which for me documentation generally is, because I'm the writer and I have technical knowledge, but I'm not, the subject matter expert on the things that I'm writing generally. So the ability to go back and forth and easily collaborate with people on my team, and then if marketing wants to do a pass on things or something like that, everybody can come and look at it, and it's easy, it's there, it's shareable. You can have 50 people in a Google Doc if you want, and everybody can edit, and it works so much better. In opposition to, say, Confluence, which we do use internally as a wiki, if you have like 12 people trying to edit a page, it tells you there's too many. If you try to save, you have to save other people's edits. I think Google Docs has just figured out how to do collaborative writing very well, and so I have just stuck with it.
That's fair. It's a completely straightforward answer, frankly. What more can be said, right? So another question coming in here, which is just more of a grab bag. What are some of the best practices regarding writing documentation as an engineer?
Ooh, as an engineer.
Yeah.
So I have a document somewhere of how to write documentation, but I don't have it up in front of me, and I wrote that for our engineers. Um, but think about the like who, what, when, where, and why of what you're doing. What do people actually need to know? How are they going to use it? When are they going to use it? Where are they going to use it? And try to answer those questions. Some of the things that you might want to tell them about as an engineer might not be the things that they actually need to know. So sit down and think about like, what is the purpose of this, and what do we need to tell the users or the customers about this? I think is sort of the main thing. Is just sitting down and thinking like, what do they actually need to know, versus I wrote this so I can give them all of the information they could ever want. But what is it that they actually need? Do they need to configure something? Do they need to set something up? Do we need to explain what this is used for? So sitting down and thinking through those questions gives you a really good start.
So trying to almost have a good North Star. What are we aiming at? What's the end goal of this? And start at that point, and I don't want to say work backwards, but at least know what you're aiming at.
Yeah, and some other best practices are don't assume anything when you're writing documentation. Never assume the knowledge level of your user, because you don't know who's going to stumble across it. I write documentation about some fairly complicated DevOps stuff, but that doesn't mean that only advanced DevOps people are going to stumble across it. It could be some lone web developer who just happens to need this solution to do what they're doing. So I make sure that everything is clearly defined. Anything that we don't explain how to do, there's links to instructions on how to do. There's a glossary of terms in case you don't know all of these fancy DevOps terms. That's fine. I'm going to define them for you. I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And along with that, be aware of your language. Documentation isn't a thesis. Try and keep it at an 8th grade level or lower is what we generally aim for in writing for the web. There's a really great app called the Hemingway app that I use for almost all of my writing that will find your sentences that are too complicated and help you simplify them. Because I also know that we're writing for a huge variety of people. They could be people for whom English isn't a first language, or people with comprehension issues. But making sure that your writing isn't too complex or flowery or overly technical. Don't use technical jargon if you don't need to use it. Just explain in plain terms what you are doing. And I think that goes a really long way.
Would it be handy to have a lot of organizations, for example, have brand identity documents where they say this is our brand and this is how we present ourselves to the world. Would it be handy or useful to have such a thing for documentation, and what form might that take?
Absolutely. I actually have a document that I call our technical manual of style, where I talk about some of these things, as well as how we're going to write different words. Like I have lists of like commonly camel cased words and like words you think are camel cased, but they're not. So I have lists of those in there so that they don't trip you up, and lists of things like how we're going to, whether we're going to put a hyphen in email or not, and things like that. And, what style guide we're going to follow, and we're using APA style for our documentation. And so we have those kinds of things, as well as my general guidance on, language and all of that. So yes, having a technical manual of style or something like that is very, very helpful. I also keep, this is only slightly related, but I also keep a sort of living glossary document for everyone in our team. That's just sort of a piece of internal documentation. That's this giant spreadsheet of basically every term ever used in our company, like every technical term, including some weird marketing terms, because I didn't know those either. So if you come into our company and you don't know what's going on, like here's a list of all of the crazy DevOps terms that you are now hearing and what they mean and where we use them. So I think that's also a helpful sort of internal thing that you can have as well.
So the internal documentation is something I think that gets glossed over, especially for engineers who think, well, I'm writing a thing and I need, if it's open source, I need to write a README, or if we have a feature, we need to an API, people need to know how to query the API. But internal documentation is a real thing, and you've touched on one example there, which is a glossary of terms. We have people coming to the organization who've not worked in this discipline before. What would be some other good types of internal documentation that would be, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but that would be a good places to get started, especially for small organizations wanting to get their feet wet?
So we're currently trying to sort of overhaul some of our documentation. So some of this is top of mind for me. Some of our internal documentation includes client onboarding. So how we onboard a client from beginning to end. New employee onboarding, how we onboard our employees, and what that looks like when you're an engineer versus, if you're someone else in the company. I'm trying to think of what else. We have tons of internal documentation for our customer support people that is stuff that we don't, that doesn't need to be public facing, like how they manage our, problems within our hosting and our, when things go wrong. So that's what we host currently in Confluence is our internal documentation. So having, an internal wiki where people can find all of that kind of thing is really helpful. Anything that would go in our employee handbook is actually public, but it's still sort of internal documentation. So anything, that goes in an employee handbook, make sure that's all documented. People want to know, they want to have a place to go to find all of the information that they need. So these are things that we've been working on improving as well.
Excellent, excellent. Making that public is a bold move. You see a handful of tech companies out there putting their handbooks, internal handbooks online. I think it's very exciting. So kudos to your organization for choosing to go that route. We have another question that came in here that got upvoted. So if you'll allow me.
Yep.
So how can a documentation writer, a technical writer, check that everything that should be covered by documentation is actually covered by documentation? In other words, how do you deal with drift between what's actually out there and what's documented?
That is a tough one. And it's one that we're dealing with a little bit now as we switch from version 1 to version 2 of our product, which will be happening in the somewhat near future. So trying to make sure that we have all of the current documentation for the current version while we are also writing the documentation for the next version. One of the things that we try to do, or that I try to do frequently, as well as something that we have new employees do, is use the documentation to set up the product. Like actually follow the documentation as if you were a user and make sure that that works for you. So that's one way to make sure that everything is up to date, all of the steps work, everything is right. Because it actually works. And it's also something that I do, before I publish documentation, I actually, if it's like a how-to and a list of steps, I actually go through it, make sure that that all works before we publish it. So that's sort of one way to double check your documentation. Like I said, the drift is one of the things I kind of addressed here in terms of keeping up, but, just trying to keep yourself in the spaces where things are being talked about, things are changing, and sometimes you can't keep up. You're not going to be able to, but you're going to have to catch up. It happens. So just doing your best to be aware of what's going on and getting that documented as soon as you can.
So try your best in many ways would be the answer there, right? Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair. All right, so last question, and this is, I think, an interesting one as well. What do you think about documentation as code? And in particular, have you ever seen any successful stories of it?
Like self-documenting code is what we're talking about, like code.
Yeah, self-documenting code, or the idea of infrastructure as code being its own documentation because it's readable by humans, stuff like that.
I don't think that there is any replacement for having, separate human readable documentation that is that is what it is intended to be. I think, making your code readable should be a goal in and of itself. Documenting your code is good in and of itself. I think those things are different from the documentation, right? We make our code readable and we document it for the next engineers or for us in 6 months. That's not the same as documenting it for the end user. So I think that those are sort of very different things. For me, infrastructure as code and, self-documenting code, that's part of the developer experience to me. And documentation, public-facing documentation, that's part of the customer experience, the user experience. So I think they're very different things. And I don't think that there are no shortcuts to good documentation.
Well, I think that's an excellent spot to end it, that there are no shortcuts to excellent documentation, but it is definitely worth it. So thank you so much, Alanna, for taking the time out to share your knowledge, your experience with us, and also for a bit of an extended Q&A, because I really wanted to get all of the questions in. So I really appreciate you being a good sport about it. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we say goodbye?
No, that's it. Just thank you for having me, and go forth and document your projects.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.